to talk, you have to know a couple of things. Knowledge is the essence of good speech. First of all, you have to know what you're talking about. Second of all, you have to know who you're talking to. You have to tailor your speech to the person that you are trying to persuade or the person you're trying to inform. And if possible, your speech should verge on or move towards dialectic. And here's the idea. Socrates doesn't want to abandon dialectic for rhetoric. Rhetoric may be necessary sometimes, as was the case in persuading Phaedrus that he had the true conception of love. But the same tendency in dialectic towards breaking things apart and putting them back together will be found in the rhetorical exercises of Socrates. In other words, he tries to make his rhetoric verge upon dialectic. And this love of divisions and putting things together, splitting things up into their natural parts and putting these natural parts together in a kind of harmony, in a kind of orderly procession, is what Socrates' conception of rhetoric always involves. And it's worth noting, I mean, when you read this, because it's a wonderful piece, how many dialectical opposites he is connecting here and bringing together. I have the margins to my book are covered with it, but let me give you some of the balance, the parts of the balancing act he's doing. The seducer is to the true lover, as the physical lover is to the mental lover, as the demagogue is to the gold politician, as the sophist is to the philosopher, as the human is to the divine, as the temporal is to the eternal, as rhetoric is to dialectic, as writing is to speech, as the first love of Lysias is to the last love of Socrates, as a donkey is to a horse, as the first speech is to the third speech, as the dark horse is to the white horse. You see how we have this set of dichotomies and this, you split the world up perfectly? As probability is to certainty, as appearance is to reality, as opinion is to knowledge, as belief is to truth, as passion is to reason, as body is to soul. You getting the idea? He's creating a sort of logical fugue. When I was reading this, it was back in California. I happened to be listening to Bach at the time. I was listening to one of the Brandenburgs, and I think the third Brandenburg was closing, and all of the gears and all of the wheels started to close in on each other, and you realize they mesh just perfectly. Well, this is something like that, a kind of verbal counterpoint. It is a perfectly organized cosmos where everything is juxtaposed against its opposite to create a completely harmonious connection of opposites. And isn't this what the organization and the ideal state of the soul really is? In other words, the self is mirrored in speech. We exist in the realm of the logos. We are souls, not bodies. And for that reason, we will find our identity, we will find ourselves in the kind of speech we make, and you will have a reflection of the soul of the speaker in someone else's speech. It is clear from Lysias' speech that he has a very disorderly soul, that the state of his chaotic soul is just like the state of his chaotic speech. That there's a one-to-one isomorphism, and exactly the opposite is true for Socrates. Socrates can juggle 15 or 20 or 30 different antinomies between body and soul, truth and falsehood, reason and passion, all these things at the same time, and then bring them together like the conductor of an orchestra. When he steps up to the podium, they all start playing as well as they possibly can, and they all come in exactly when they're supposed to. And you can't imagine a more literally musical speech. Socrates says in the Republic that we must be trained in both gymnastics and the muses. Well, the muses are here. The muse of poetry has taken control of him. Remember that he said that lyric poetry was a kind of divine madness? No one constructs something like this sitting down and logically cogitating. You need reason, of course, but you need more than that. You need divine inspiration. You need divine madness. And look at how Socrates has clearly instantiated this divine madness. He said that prophecy, and he talks about the connection between mantic and manic. Manic in Greek means insane. Mantic means prophetic. It's only a change of one letter. And this is always very important to the Greeks, that a prophecy or being divinely inspired is just one step away from being crazy. So Socrates says, look, I am divinely inspired. I can tell. Look, I'm breaking into these dithrams. So he's divinely inspired. He has that prophetic gift. In addition to that, it's a purgation. He said that those rituals and those rites which allows you to be absolved of your sins, well, this third speech is such a purgation. Remember what his first speech was like? That inferior treatment of love, which distorted his own speech, distorted his own soul, and did harm to Phaedrus by giving him wrong ideas. Well, that was a sin. That was impiety. And Socrates' daimon told him, you must make amends here and now. So he is obviously divinely inspired. This is a divine sort of madness. The third element in this divine madness, lyric poetry. this is Plato's example of lyric poetry. I'll talk in a couple of lectures about why I think this is so important. But Plato produces a lyric, perhaps the greatest of the Greek lyrics, and there are very few lyrics in any phase of history which are as superior and as excellent and as beautiful as this one. So here, to finish up, is Socrates is in love. But then again, Socrates was always in love. Not just with Phaedrus. Socrates wishes only what is good for others. And that means that Socrates would have done this for anyone. And what did he do for Phaedrus? He brought him from a condition of ignorance to a condition of knowledge. He helped organize his soul. And Phaedrus at the end says, you know, I thought Lysias was a fine man and I thought he was a fine speaker, but I'm afraid he'll cut a very poor figure now that I have seen your soul and I have seen your speech. I am much more persuaded by you. And of course, all of nature chimes in. The cicadas have been talking all afternoon. They've been making, you know, the locusts that make those noises on summers. And Socrates makes the point that the cicadas used to be men, but they loved the music, the muses so much, and they loved singing and poetry so much that they forgot to eat. And they died. But the muses really liked the fact that they were so devoted to the muses, so they made bugs out of them that sing all the time. So, of course, we're bringing in all kinds of lyric elements, the harmony of nature and of the soul. There's no change when Socrates moves outside the city because there's no distinction between nomos and phusis. There's one universal law of love, which is the same as the law of rhetoric. Organize your soul and improve the chaos within. Now, at the end of this exercise, and this might be called a hymn to love. In other words, this is clearly sacred music. Not in the sense that you sing it, although I somehow suspect that you could sing it. Eric Satie wrote a piece called Socrates, in which he borrows certain elements out of the Phaedrus, and he creates a beautiful, transparent music. And I only wish that we could find some way to set this whole thing to music. This shouldn't be read. In some ways, this should be sung. You should have that feeling that you're singing when you're reading this. If you're not putting enough of yourself into it. Take my word for it. This is music. There's secret sounds inside this. You'll find that out when you read it well enough, or thoroughly enough, or with the right state of soul. Well, Socrates says, or Phaedrus points out, well, the sun has now set, Socrates, meaning that the heat of passion is gone, that reason has become more important, and we have now created an internal order within our souls. And Socrates says, okay, now at the last we must move from poetry to philosophy. The sun is set, and Socrates has educated his Phaedrus, and Phaedrus now has an improved soul. There's one final thing that we have to do to finish off our philosophical journey. Remember that I said also that there's a journey motif throughout all the dialogues, because Socrates is the new Odysseus. Well, we moved out of the city. Now it's time to go back. Now that we've reached our goal, we've achieved our purpose. Socrates says, one more thing I want to teach you, one more thing that I have to do. I think we ought to say a prayer. The idea being, I think, that for Socrates, piety is the final stage of philosophical development. I know that it's not a popular idea now, but I think Socrates believed it, and I cannot imagine any other reason why this great dialogue would end on that sort of a note. I think the idea is that that piety is the last stage of the growth of virtue, and the final virtue, the keystone to all the others, that holds all the others together, is a sense of obligation to the divinity. And of course, in this case, love acts as a bridge between heaven and earth. It connects us to the divinity. And the speech that he gives at the end is just gorgeous. And I mean, the prayer that he gives at the end, because it's both simple and eloquent and effective, and it shows you how to pray as well as how to talk. It's really a beautiful idea. Let me read this to you. Socrates says, "Dear Pan and all the other gods that dwell in this place, grant that I may become fair within, and that such outward things as I may have may not war against the spirit within me. May I count him rich who is wise, and as for gold, may I possess so much of it as only a temperate man might bear and carry with him." Is there anything more that we can ask for, Phaedrus? The prayer contents me. And Phaedrus says, make it a prayer for me too, since friends have all things in common. And then they go back to the city. So I think the argument is that love reaches into the soul, organizes the soul, and divinizes the soul. It makes you divine because you encounter some image of a divinity in another that allows you to be something other than a cogito, a limited ego that is stuck within itself. We move to our real selves. We understand our real selves only when we are in the presence of some other soul. our souls exist with reference to, with contrast to, with connection to other souls. This is the value of love, and the connection between love and rhetoric is that it provides us a bridge from one soul to the other, and the connection between heaven and earth is justified by the fact that, is explained and articulated and made comprehensible by the fact that the gods have sent us this wonderful gift. Socrates is the origin of Western speculation. Of all the philosophers and thinkers in the Western tradition, Socrates is far and away the most enigmatic and difficult and maddening. And part of the difficulty is because we never see Socrates' writings and we never hear things directly from Socrates' own mouth. The source of our knowledge of Socrates is primarily from Plato and a little bit also from Xenophon, and a few things that come down to us from the Greek intellectual tradition. But the difficulty in interpreting Socrates lies primarily in the fact that he never talks directly to us. Most of our knowledge of Socrates comes from the collected dialogues of Plato, and what I'd like to do in the next couple of days is lecture on the dialogues of Plato, talking about Socrates and what he means for the contemporary state of our minds, the contemporary state of the world, and to try and articulate what Socrates himself does not articulate, which is who he is and what his writings amount to, or what his speakings amount to. Now, one source prior to Plato and apart from Plato for our knowledge of Socrates is found in Xenophon. Xenophon was also in the Socratic circle, at least briefly, and managed to meet Socrates, knew Socrates' work, and the difficulty in getting a sense of Socrates from Xenophon's memorabilia, from his written work, lies in the fact that Xenophon was a very pedestrian kind of a thinker, whereas Plato was highly poetic and gifted as a dramatist as well as a thinker, able to follow the difficult elements of Socrates' philosophy and give it a beautiful literary form. Xenophon was a much more pedestrian mind. He really didn't appreciate the gravity and the seriousness and the terrible beauty that was inside Socrates. You might say that if Xenophon had read Moby Dick, he would tell you that it was a book about whales. And Moby Dick is about whales. I mean, you couldn't describe it without discussing cetology someplace along the line. But Moby Dick is about a lot more than whales, and Socratic philosophy is about a lot more than a wise man walking around saying enigmatic, sometimes ironic things. So Xenophon's interpretation of Socrates gives us the picture of a wise man, but this wise man is not especially distinguishable from other wise men. He's something like an Athenian Ben Franklin, an intelligent fellow, says things that will improve youth, but you don't get the sense of that heroic depth from Xenophon's treatment of Socrates that you do from Plato's. Plato's is the real stuff of our understanding of Socrates. Now in Plato, we don't see something like Ben Franklin. We see a sort of demon, something that's superior to human life, something that has a love and a passion for knowledge that exceeds what anyone could possibly hope for within the confines of human possibility. Socrates, for Plato, is a sort of demon of knowledge, a hero of thinking that is intended as an image of what Greek life could become. In other words, Plato is trying to transform Socrates into a new and higher and finer ideal. So we never really get Socrates himself. We get a very pedestrian description from Xenophon, or we get some sort of idealization, a classical form, something like a Greek statue, which takes the empirical elements of Socratic dialogue and Socratic philosophy and turns them into something more, something superhuman. So in Plato, we get more than a man, and in Xenophon, we get merely a wise man. So to try and figure out where Socrates is among those different descriptions is not easy, and it'll take us the next couple of days. I'm going to be doing 15 more lectures after this one on the Platonic dialogues. Hopefully, we'll resolve some of these questions. Now, we ought to think also about the intellectual background of post-Berkeley Athens, and particularly the influences that were upon Socrates and Plato. What did they have uppermost in their mind? What were the big issues that they had to address? Well, for Socrates, first of all, there's the fact of mathematics. Greek mathematics prior to Socrates, for the previous 100 years or so, had been making great strides, and in particular, in the case of Pythagoras, mathematics was connected to numerology, number magic. It hadn't completely separated itself from the earlier mythical accounts of the world. So mathematics, at least for Pythagoras, was a quasi-religious enterprise. Pythagoras was the leader of a sort of monastic mathematical community, that had a number of religious elements and religious rules associated with it. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. Pythagoras believed that mathematical things were eternal and that somehow mathematics was the marrow of the things that we experience in the external world. Our sense perceptions are somehow limited or formed by mathematics. And Socrates took that idea up. He was very influenced by Pythagoras and by Pythagorean attempts to create a cosmos, an orderly universe, out of the chaos of sense perception. So Pythagoras is going to be very important, one of the big sources of Socratic philosophy. Now, Socrates also has things that he's clearly opposed to. First and foremost is the pre-Socratic physicists. In Ionia, which are the islands between Greece and Turkey, about the 100 years before the time of Socrates, physicists had been creating, for the first time in the Western tradition, materialistic, rational, non-teleological accounts of nature. What I mean by this is that they were accounting for the phenomena of nature without reference to any kind of myth and without reference to any kind of purpose. Nature was a blind, irrational set of material objects constantly in flux. So if we think about Thales or Anaximander or Anaximenes, what we will see there is an attempt to give accounts of nature using primitive atomic theory that can be applied across the board to all phenomena of sense perception. And the point of these Ionian physicists is to give a new and better non-mythological account of nature. The sun, instead of being Apollo's golden chariot being driven across the sky by the god of the sun, instead is going to be transformed into a hot rock. And this, while it looks more or less innocuous, while it doesn't strike us as being particularly important, is in fact of the greatest consequence for political and moral order. And Socrates is primarily concerned with political and moral order. He is only interested in the physicists and in their findings insofar as this naturalism is a threat to political and moral order. Prior to the development of a rational, non-teleological physics, our understanding of nature and our understanding of political order and moral obligation were connected. We had a mythological view which encompassed all of them. Once nature is separated out as being a non-mythological, ateleological realm, we lose, for example, the force of our oaths. When we swear by the sun, at one time we'd been swearing by the sun god and it had a religious significance. If the sun is truly a hot rock, then all our oaths are only sounds, only words. Socrates is convinced that this new ateleological physics is a danger to morality, is a danger to political order. He believes that the concomitant of the Ionian physicists, Thales and Anaxagoras, and later Empedocles and Democritus, he thinks that the implication of that is that when you transfer this naturalistic, materialistic mindset from the realm of nature, astronomy and botany and biology and physics, when you move that from nature to our study of the social world, what it does is lead to a sort of corrosive skepticism, a skepticism which undermines all our belief in right and wrong, in moral order. It makes us completely selfish and completely devious and completely untrustworthy. It breaks the bounds of moral order, and in other words, physics creates a sort of centrifugal force in our social relations which drives us all to atomized individuality. It breaks all social bonds, even those of family and city. So Socrates is convinced that the sophists are in some ways sort of the nephews or the godchildren of the physicists. If you continue this materialistic approach to the world and apply it to laws and to politics, what you will get is sophistry, the attempt to self-consciously manipulate words to get the ends that you desire. There is no natural law in the sense of a moral order to the world. If that's the case, then the sophists are the wise men that see this moral vacuum and cash in on it, take advantage with a new techne, this new techne of speech. The Greek word techne means art, and it's the source of our word technical, and it means craft in the sense that you can account for a particular act of making, a particular account of craftsmanship. You can explain what it is you're doing. So an artist is a craftsman, is someone that knows what they're doing most precisely. In reviewing and summing up and evaluating the Platonic dialogues, the most difficult problem is the problem of Socrates. Most of the great philosophers in the Western tradition have had to grapple with this problem because Socrates is the kind of fountainhead, the hero of Western speculation, the authoritative voice of reason which tells us inquire and think and use your head. And yet, What lies behind the mask? What kind of a man is Socrates? What shall we think of this demonic hero of love and hero of knowledge? What are we to make of this after looking at all the dialogues? And unlike Plato, which is relatively straightforward, it's not so hard to get a grasp on Plato. Distinguishing the construction Socrates or the historical Socrates from what we find in the dialogues is very difficult, so I'm not even going to try it. I'm going to say, on the basis of the dialogues, what can we say about Socrates? What have we found out? Well, Socrates is interested in the problem of identity, and we're interested in the problem of his identity. Who is Socrates? At the beginning of the Gorgias and at the beginning of the Protagoras, when Socrates grapples with these great sophists, he has himself or his student ask Gorgias and Protagoras, "Who are you?" And what he's asking then is, what is your function? What do you do in society? What is your particular purpose in life? And it's not clear what Socrates' purpose is. He talks in the Apology, he talks of himself as being a gadfly and as driving the somnolent people towards virtue by impressing upon them the limits of and the extent of their own ignorance. But in fact, it's got to be more than that, because the difficulty with Socrates lies in the fact that he wears so many masks. How do we distinguish between the persona of Socrates and the man himself? Very, very difficult. Certainly as an object within the dialogues, as a new kind of hero, he is the universal hero of this universal kind of poetry. The lyrical lover of souls as opposed to bodies. He's the ideal lover, and he's the demon of love. He's the eudaimon, the eudaimonia of Athens. In other words, he is the happiness and the spirit of love within Athens. As an epic hero, he's the new hero of knowledge. He's on the spiritual journey. That's all true. He's a kind of an epic figure, a larger-than-life creature. He's the new tragic hero without the tragic flaw. He's, in particular, though, and I would emphasize this, he's the new hero of humor. Socrates is a great comic hero. But there's a big difference in the kind of comedy we get in Socrates. Here we have not a human comedy, as we saw in Aristophanes. What we get in Socrates and in the Platonic dialogues as they represent Socrates is a divine comedy, a comedy which offers us a glimpse at something more, something higher. Instead of a comedy which points at human foibles, human depravity, it points beyond them towards something else. And this divine comedy that Socrates offers us means that he's a new and improved comic hero. And what will be connected with this is the fact that the dialogues are full of jokes, but the jokes are on the people that Socrates talks to. Socrates doesn't get fooled in the dialogues. No, Socrates is a sort of universal straight man. The joke is on everybody else. Note that in the dialogues, Socrates only laughs once over many hundreds of pages, talking to many different kinds of people, making all kinds of dramatic and symbolic and logical jokes. Socrates only laughs once. He's making jokes all the time, and other people laugh every once in a while, but the joke is inevitably on them. Socrates is one of the wittiest and most humorous of men, which is a very surprising characteristic in one of the great philosophical heroes of the Western tradition. He is living in his own comedy, but he's a straight man. The joke is on the people he talks to, and when we read the dialogues, the joke is on us. We should not make the mistake of thinking that because Socrates is making jokes that he is lacking in moral seriousness, and we should also not make the mistake of thinking that Socrates is laughing at us merely with the intention of ridiculing us. All of the dialogues, all of art, all of Socrates' activities are intended to be educational, and we are supposed to get from Socrates a kind of moral education. That is what he is trying to show us. Kierkegaard, one of my favorite philosophers, was also a great admirer of Socrates. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Socratic irony, and he was particularly interested in irony himself, and he's particularly interested in the state of the soul. And he made a very interesting observation about Socrates once. He said that all melancholic men have the best senses of humor, that the funniest men are almost inevitably melancholy, and that one serves as a mask for the other. And I strongly suspect that that's the case, at least when we consider Socrates. That is to say, Kierkegaard himself was quite ironic and had a wonderful sense of humor and was a decisively melancholic individual. And the fact that he should recognize that in Socrates suggests to me that Socrates was a highly melancholic individual. At least this is my Socrates. Reading it now again, in the middle part of my life, I can't help but believe that behind this persistent good humor, this persistent drive towards improving himself and improving others, there is a dark side here. Perhaps it's true of all comedians, but the greatest of the comic heroes, Socrates, I think, has a persistent streak of melancholy. Kierkegaard, who knows himself and who knows irony and who has a wonderful sense of humor, perhaps senses a kindred spirit here. It also appears to me that Gorgias, remember when we talked about him during the dialogue about the same name, that Gorgias has a certain streak of melancholy, and that is what drives him to the extreme of sophistry in the same way that Socrates is driven towards the extreme of philosophy, both being pursued by the demons of unhappiness. Both afraid, or if not afraid, both being pushed along towards their extreme path because nothing in this world is completely satisfactory to them. As Alcibiades says of Socrates at the end of the symposium, he does not love the way we love. He does not love the things that we love. If you think about the encomium on Socrates at the end of the symposium, Alcibiades says he's not interested in sex the way we are. He's not interested in money. Look, he's never made any money. He's the smartest guy in Athens. At a time when Alcibiades was with him on a military campaign, Socrates showed great bravery and took care of Alcibiades, but then was disdainful of military decorations and give them to Alcibiades. He would really like them. The idea is that Socrates cannot find in this world of space and time, in the things that most men pursue most of the time, does not find anything that satisfies him or gratifies him or makes him feel that this is worthy of him. Socrates' entire thought and his entire drive is towards something else, something higher, something superior. Remember that at the end, in the Phaedo, when Socrates is dying, he says, I expect two things to happen. One, I'm sure that I'm going to the gods, which is where he's perhaps always belonged. And two, with any luck, I will find up there good and virtuous men and women that have lived lives down here that were praiseworthy and that were divine, and then I'll be able to talk to them. And what will be most entertaining about heaven is that I'll meet more people that are more interesting to talk to than the people I met down here. You might almost think it was a bitter irony, but Socrates has no bitterness. What he is saying is that this world has been a great disappointment to him. And the people around him, he did his best with them, but they have disappointed him. And he doesn't hold that against him. He knows that all wrongdoing is involuntary. He knows that they don't mean to be ignorant or mean-spirited or cruel, but they are not what they could be. And the world around us is imperfect, is not what it could be. And it makes him long for a permanence and an excellence and a virtue that he does not find down here in the world of space and time. He is the true daemon of love, but this daemon has one foot in the world of space and time and one foot in the beyond somehow. And all his jokes seem to suggest that he is comparing the true world of unchanging reality, of perfect formality, with this world down here, and this world has been judged and found lacking. Many of his jokes suggest that he's in on the joke of the gods, and that he realizes that the things that we pursue, that the things we take seriously, are not to be taken seriously. He wants to move us away from our pursuit of wealth, or pleasure, or power, towards the pursuit of something divine. In some ways, Socrates is a joke played upon us by the gods. He has been sent down here, who clearly does not belong here, and that is why Socrates is always making jokes, jokes that we don't understand, jokes that the interlocutors don't understand. Whenever Socrates' interlocutors laugh, they're always laughing at their own jokes or at something that seems foolish, but in fact, the times when they laugh are almost always inappropriate. In fact, Socrates is being serious and people laugh at him, and then when he's being kind of jocular, when he's joking with people, people would take it with grim seriousness. This irony allows him to conceal his own superiority. In other words, irony, which is a kind of dissembling, which is very similar, perhaps the first cousin of telling a lie, right, really isn't a lie. It's a sort of deceptive gesture which keeps people from realizing how superior a man he is. And I suppose irony in this sense is a sort of mechanism of self-preservation. The people around him are unworthy of Socrates, and it's not just true of the people that lived in the same space and time with Socrates. After reading the dialogues, it's hard to come away with the feeling that we are worthy of him. it is hard to think that we can live up to these high ideals. In that respect, by showing us our ineptitude and our viciousness, our incompleteness, he is playing a joke on us, saying you came here looking for wisdom, and in fact the only wisdom I can give you is that you have a lot longer to go. You have a long way to go. That's the best thing I could tell you. Socrates has hidden himself. Socrates, like God, is mysterious and enigmatic, and he seems to be playing some sort of joke with us, based upon the idea that he has seen both realms and we are poor creatures of space and time. Perhaps that would make anyone melancholic, the longing for home, the longing for permanence, the longing for heaven, which all of us have some doubts about. Perhaps the internal jokes, the internal humor, what is hidden behind the mask is something angelic and divine. Well, Socrates has played his little game of irony and has been laughing up his sleeve all his career, as Alcibiades says. And Alcibiades, having taken on the voice of the god, we are assured is telling us the truth. And I'm fairly confident that if Socrates had not been ironic, he would have been killed much earlier in his career. Suppose that Socrates had said directly to the people of Athens, "You're vicious and ignorant, and you should let me run the state immediately," and had completely refrained from hiding behind this ironic mask, and from only talking to a few people. Suppose he had said, "You're vicious and corrupt, and you deserve to lose the Peloponnesian War because you can't control yourselves, much less other people. You deserve these political catastrophes." Well, I think that he would have been killed as a treasonable, as an evil man, as a man who is in conflict with the good of the people around him, and of course he would have been even more completely misunderstood then. So perhaps the irony here is the fact that instead of hiding himself or concealing himself, in his irony, Socrates reveals as much of himself as we can possibly absorb. But there's no excess. And you become spiritually or mentally prepared for reading the dialogues as you purify yourself, as you move from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge, as you read them several times, as you start to compare them across space and time, across the different parts of the dialogues. What you begin to get is a sort of spiritual journey of your own. You follow the path of Socrates from one idea to another, and then the irony begins to strip away. You never, I think, completely get rid of the layers of irony. It's like an onion, has many layers to it. But as you study them, and as you prepare your own soul, as you absorb the Socratic knowledge, the ironies, at least the immediate, apparent, surface ironies, begin to disappear. But I think the ironies never disappear completely. The final irony is that the irony only conceals as much as you conceal from yourself. Right? It is a test of the soul. It is a mirror of the soul. Remember the Phaedrus, that good and loving rhetoric which tries to improve the beloved, constructs the identity and shows you who you are? I think that every person projects himself or herself into the Socratic dialogues. When you read them, you cannot but push your own agenda, your own sets of thoughts in there. Look at the great philosophers and what they have done, the tremendously disparate interpretations we have gotten of Socrates. Think of Nietzsche's spiteful and evil interpretation of Socrates. There's clearly a tremendous amount of envy here in Nietzsche's interpretation of Socrates' death scene. Think of Kierkegaard. His own melancholia comes out, and he recognizes it in Socrates. And they are in some ways talking about different men, because different parts of the mask have been taken off, depending on what you can bring to the dialogues. The dialogues are a test of your own spiritual resources, and as they increase, the amount of irony decreases, but perhaps the irony is infinite, so no matter how many ironic masks you remove, there's still a mask underneath. Socrates then is a standing challenge and a standing joke, because he is the greatest of comic heroes. It's a joke that's too deep for us to plumb. We can't get to the bottom of this divine comedy. And Socrates tells us that much, that in so many words, in more than one occasion. The telos of his irony, the purpose of his irony, because remember that he's interested in teleology, he's interested in purposive activity and purposive accounts of the external world. The telos of irony is education. And he educates us with this irony because irony is a provocation. He points us in the right direction by making us feel foolish and stupid. I ought to be able to understand this book. I've been reading it for many years now, and alas, I do not. it also is a temptation. He says, I dare you to come and understand this. I dare you to get underneath my final mask. These ironies are intended to push us along, to goad us towards a deeper and richer and finer reading of the dialogues, which involves improving ourselves and increasing the stock of intellectual and spiritual resources we bring to the dialogues. What do we find out at the end? We find out how ignorant we are, how extensive the domain of our foolishness and vice is. And what that does for us is increase our consciousness. It increases our self-knowledge. As the Oracle at Delphi says, know thyself. Socrates is the man who's particularly good at knowing himself, and the process by which his self-knowledge is extended to other people so that they might know themselves is continued not just in Socrates' lifetime, but throughout the history of the dialogues. When we read the dialogues, we find out about Socrates, and Socrates offers us a chance to look at ourselves, to introspect and examine our own souls. And what do we find in our own souls? Viciousness, ignorance, insufficient and unsatisfactory spiritual resources. All this is protreptic. It is an exhortation, pushing us on the journey of the dialectic. We too must become new heroes of soul, new heroes of mind. Socrates offers us a heroism that we can emulate because we are ignorant, vicious, foolish people who are best off if we stop fooling ourselves. Knowledge, like charity, begins at home, begins within the soul. And if we're going to be nice to other people, we might just as well be nice to ourselves. Stop fooling ourselves. Stop kidding ourselves. Stop relaxing in intellectual slackness and intellectual vice. The point of Socrates is not the eternal questions, what is reality, what is being? That's foolishness. Or the eternal answers. Nothing is more unsocratic than the idea of eternal answers. No, there's just the provisional answer that we'll accept for now, and if it turns out that we change our minds later for some good reason, that is the most Socratic thing. Not being caught in this ossified dogma. If the theory of forms turns out to be unsatisfactory, the most Socratic thing in the world is to get rid of it. It would be easy to draw the wrong inference from what I said about Plato's doubts about the theory of forms later on in his career. Socrates perhaps gave up the theory of forms, or perhaps never even had the theory of forms. Who knows and who cares? Socrates is not the purveyor of a set of dogmas, a finished set of conclusions. He is showing us how to ask questions of other people and also of ourselves. And we must be sure that as we ask these questions, as we embark upon this Pythagorean spiritual journey, as we follow in the footsteps of Socrates insofar as we can, we not be overtaken with the solemnity of the occasion. We should not get the misapprehension that we are really important and that we are really significant. In fact, self-importance is the opposite of Socratic self-understanding. In fact, your importance lies in the fact that you are on the spiritual journey, and it's not the destination, it's the process of getting where you're going. The gods love a joke, and Socrates is a joke that has been played upon us by the gods. Perhaps this whole human world, this all of human life, is that kind of a joke. And there's a wonderful passage in the Cratylus, a dialogue that I didn't do, that exemplifies this in a beautiful way. I want to read it to you because it is very funny. And you could easily pass over this and not understand that this is intended as a joke. This is a Cratylus, section 406b. His interlocutor asks, what is the meaning of Dionysus and Aphrodite? Now remember what the symbolism is here. Dionysus, drunkenness, excess, art, emotion, and Aphrodite, the human sex drive? So in other words, what is the significance of our emotions? In other words, asking the great sage, what does our bronze part, the part which dominates in almost all of us almost all the time, what does it mean, Socrates? And Socrates says, son of Hipponicus, you ask a solemn question. There is a serious and also a facetious explanation for both of these names. The serious explanation is not to be had from me, but there is no objection to your hearing a facetious one, for the gods too love a joke. The disorganized state of our emotional life, the fact that we are not in control of Dionysus and Aphrodite, is a joke played upon us by the gods. And to think that there is some solemn answer that we can get from Socrates about these things is a joke we play on ourselves. In fact, Socrates says, look, a facetious answer is not no answer. And even though we don't achieve any final wisdom in the Socratic dialogues, he teaches us that we should not take ourselves or this project too seriously. And if the project of self-knowledge, if the project of the Socratic dialectic is not a thing to be taken seriously, surely things like political power and wealth and pleasure are even less noble, even less worthy. And certainly the people that take them seriously are the ones who are even worse off than the ones who take knowledge seriously. There perhaps is nothing in human life which we should take with grim seriousness. Only God, only the divinity is truly serious. So if you are caught up in some kind of jumble, if you are in an emotional tangle, if you are in an emotional or a personal tangle with other people, be quiet, relax, and reflect. You may think that you are in a jam. You may think that all these things are important. This is the world of illusion. And the biggest illusion that we carry with us is the fact that we are important and all the projects we have decided to engage in are important. Relax, step back, take a deep breath, and inquire into yourself. Pursue your own knowledge of yourself. It is far more important than anything you will get from the external world. This is an important part of the Socratic legacy. Now, jokes like this are extremely serious. Socrates is a serious joke. Again, do not make the mistake of thinking that playfulness and seriousness are incompatible. Alas, they are not. He has been playing jokes on us all through, and he's just pointing out to us that we have been playing jokes on ourselves. And perhaps we will finally achieve a sort of Socratic sense of humor when we start to play jokes not on ourselves but on other people. The kind of beneficial, morally improving jokes that are involved in teaching other people what they are and showing other people how, if not to gain virtue, how to move towards virtue, how to open their mind and liberate their souls. Now, how do we get down to the bottom of this? Is there any bottom of this, or is this just an infinite regress of larger and larger and more profound philosophical jokes? And I think that, I don't know if we can get to the bottom, but we can move asymptotically towards it. The jokes in the dialogues tease us. They say, look, you're foolish enough to have taken this seriously the last time you read it, but now you underline it in a different color because you realize that this is ironic rather than true. The irony, the flip-flop between stating something and stating the opposite, teases us, provokes us because of the thread it offers us to our self-conception, to our understanding of ourselves as being vessels of self-contained wisdom. He punctures those vessels and says, look, you aren't even close to what you think you are. Your self-conception is flawed. And this forces us, this enigmatic kind of irony, forces us to ask defensive questions of the dialogues. And what's most remarkable and miraculous about these dialogues is that when we ask them the right questions, they answer. The dialogues speak to us. The dialogues are a mimesis, a representation of the living voice. That's what's immortal about Socrates and immortal about the dialogues. They represent the immediate articulation of persistent human problems, persistent human questions. And that's why they never get out of style. The questions may change, but the changes are minor compared to the fact that the idea of questioning at all, the idea of pursuing knowledge of yourself and by implication knowledge of other people, that's what's permanent in Socrates. He is the image of the inquirer. Now, I don't know what the final joke of the dialogues is, but let me give you a shot at it, or do the best I can with it, at the risk of making myself kind of foolish, at the risk of making a joke of myself. I think the biggest joke in the dialogues is that they don't teach you anything. I read this big fat book many times. Some of these dialogues I've read 30, 40, 50 times, something like the Republic. And at the end of all this reading, I spent years reading this stuff, you don't learn anything. It is arguably the most profound philosophy ever constructed. It is arguably the deepest and most enigmatic set of poetic, logical images brought together in one unique kind of an art form. And after reading it, what do you find out? Keep thinking. Keep thinking, and it's like a carrot and stick. You take another step along the road of dialectic, and do you get the carrot? You never get the carrot. You never get to the form of knowledge, the form of the good. Think about Glaucon climbing up out of the cave with Socrates and says, Socrates, what is the form of the good? And Socrates says, sorry, this is where the journey of dialectic ends. Now you got to take it on your own, kid. What? In some ways, it's a real sad irony, but on the other hand, perhaps he's just saying that language is asymptotic. Human life never achieves the divine. It is outside our capacities altogether. There is, strictly speaking, no Socratic dogma. There is no set of conclusions that allows you to be a Socratic. If you look at the whole history of the criticism of the Socratic dialogues, the philosophers project a great deal more of themselves into their interpretation of this than they pull out. If you were from a completely alien culture, from Mars, for example, and came down and looked at the various interpretations of Socrates throughout the 25th century history since Socrates was alive, you would almost guess that they were different people. Nietzsche's interpretation has nothing to do with the interpretations offered by the Neoplatonists. And the Neoplatonist conception of Socrates is very different from that of Kierkegaard. We only get out of the dialogues what we bring in.